Hello and welcome to this Global Power Platform Bootcamp. And welcome to my session, Power Automate Best Pattern and Practices with Dr. Flo. So I'm Dr. Flo. I'm also known as Serge Luca. I'm a Power Platform MVP based in Brussels. I've been MVP for almost 20 years. I work for Fluxys, an oil and gas company, and I'm in charge of the Power Platform governance, but also the Power Platform architecture and the support. So here are the different parts of this presentation. Architecture, we'll discuss some limitation of the tool, good practices, and some new feature, mostly AI related. And very important, no marketing this presentation, only real feature. But of course, AI is important. Let's start from some extremely important architecture concept. The rule when you create complex application, including a combination of Power Apps and Power Automate, is to keep it simple. But don't forget the good practices learned over 30 years and shared by the industry, which is that if complexity increase, you have to organize your apps in layer. And in my case, I always organize my app in layers. So normally we have several layers, like the presentation layer, which can be programmed with Power Apps, SharePoint Form, Microsoft Forms, cards, agent. We have, on the other side, we have data source, and we want to make change or retrieve information from these data sources. And in between, we have an important layer that we call the business layer. And the business layer is supposed to implement the business rule. And if you want to make change into the data source, you will have to go through the business layer. You can implement the business layer with different tools like flows, plugins, Power FX function, business process flow, AI builder, agent. And traditionally, we have a data access layer, which provides an abstraction of the data source. But most of the time in the Power Platform, we don't change the data source. So we don't need this data access layer. So basically, we have this. If you want to make some change into the data, the presentation layer will talk to the business layer, which will implement the change. For reading information, the presentation layer can directly read information from the data source. And you have to minimize the filter because in the data source, you can implement, as you will see later, the security, so you don't have to filter who can see what. Actually, you have usually more layers. You might have an analytics layer, which where you will implement the dashboard and reports, and you can use Power BI for that. And analytics layer will grab the data directly from the data source. These data source have different features, like for instance, Dataverse provide direct query, which means that if the data change in the Dataverse or in Oracle or SQL Server, then you will see the change in the reports. That's not the case in SharePoint, because in SharePoint, you have to wait for a refresh of the data source to be triggered, like every 8 hours, for instance. You see, so there are some differences between these data sources when it comes to analytics layer. You might need a logging layer. A logging layer is where you keep a trace of all the activities of the end user, and you can implement that with different tools like Azure Application Insight, a third-party tool like Splunk, or a bunch of flows storing information in Dataverse. Then we have the security layer that I will discuss later. So basically, security layer makes sure that the people can only see their own data, right? And people forget the archiving layer because information is created, consumed, but there is a retention somehow, right? So the retention policy is managed by the archiving layer, and usually we can implement that by writing some schedule flow, but we can also leverage the Dataverse long-term retention. This slide illustrates an example of a layer, in this case the archiving layer, and all my layers follow the same naming convention. So basically in my solution, if the layer is implemented as flows, Power Automate flows, you will see the name of the project here, followed by the name of the layer and what the flow does. So you can quickly identify all the components that belong to a layer here. So if it's security, for instance, you will see security here. Just to illustrate one example, I've actually two examples, but let's start from the first one. The security layer. How can we assign unique permission to a record? So let's say you create an application where you create data, and when you create data, data has to be approved by some users, user 1, user 2, user X, and when the data have been approved by a small audience, then you can share it with a bigger audience, right? So this is setting unique permission to a record. And many people don't know how to do that in the Power Platform. And that's important. And the way I do it is I create a private team, which is empty, or just the application administrator are part of this team. So it's a Power Platform team. So you go to the environment settings and you create your team here, private team. And then in your code, you change, we assume that you are using Dataverse, of course. You change the record ownership to the private team. And you can do that in a flow by using the update a row action, where you select the row ID and you change the owner to the private team owner. Okay, so it's team parties and the ID of the private team that you just created. So from after this row here, nobody can see nobody can see the record. But of course, now the next step here, in the next step, you'll have to share the record with the approver, right? So you need to grant access to the approver. So here, user 1, user 2, user X. And to do this, you can use the action, perform an unbound action. Okay. You select the action grant access here, and you pass the principal access, which is this here, where you specify the user ID of the approver and the permission, in this case read access, okay, and you set that to the record here. And then, since then, user 1, user 2, user X will be able to see your record. A second example of logic in a security layer is something that I use plenty of time, which is I want to have a component that allow me to check if a user belongs to a group. It could be a Microsoft 365 group, or it could be a security group. And we need this feature because in one application, some screens can be visible to some specific people. So if people belong to an admin, they might see, or to the application administration, they might see some specific administration screen. So what I do is I implement this by writing a flow that starts with the Power Apps trigger, like this. I pass two parameters, the user email and the name of the group. And then the flow will first retrieve the ID of this group. So if you use the group connector, you can use the Graph API here, and you pass just the name of the group, and this will return the group ID. And from this group ID, you can check if the user is in the group. Okay, so just this Graph API, you have the group ID, and you pass just the email of the user. So that's very easy, and that's very important actually. So you can implement the same code with Power FX, like this. You see, but for me, I prefer the Automate flows, and I will explain why. Because there's a lot of benefit of moving some logic from Power Apps and Copilot Studio to flows, and the benefit are this provide code reusability and more consistency logic across your application. Flow are easier to unit test, easier to debug, easier to maintain. Flow provide elevation of privilege. Some part of your flow can do more than what the end user can do. I will illustrate that later. And you can create enterprise-wide service library with Automate flows. So I mentioned elevation of privilege. Indeed, PowerFX code always run with the identity of the current user, and that's by design. It's very secure. Same for PowerFix function, server-side PowerFX function. But code in Automate can be elevated, and that can be very interesting if your code need to access some data source that the end user cannot, like some system table, for instance. And you can do that by writing child flow or by writing flow that benefit from the run-only user feature. And typically this flow, starting with a button, with one SharePoint connector, SharePoint action, Dataverse action, can benefit from the run-only user. So when you edit this, you can specify which connection you want to use for which action. So you can elevate the identity. Same for this one, same for this one, okay? Same for this one. I mentioned that with Automate Flow, you can create enterprise-wide service library. Indeed, since the early days of Automate, when the Automate flow started with when an HTTP request is received, like this one, your flow became a web service. Right? It's still there, right? It's still interesting. But a few years ago, when you did it, the web service had a public IP, public URL, and this public URL could potentially be used by anyone who knows the URL. Okay, so and this made this trigger, well, very dangerous. But now Microsoft changed this, and in this trigger you can specify who can see, who can access the web service. So basically, now I can specify that any user in my tenant can access the web service, and the Automate flow that I showed before that check if a user belongs to a specific group, the same code can be now become a web service. Exactly the same code, except the trigger and the response. And this means that you can use this web service as a child flow within the same environment. You see, run a child flow and you will retrieve your web service flow if they are in the same environment. But you can also call this web service across environment by using the invoke an HTTP request, where you can pass the URL of the request and you can pass parameter in JSON. Or even better, you can quickly create a custom connector on top of this web service, and you can share this custom connector so that citizen developer can just call the connector and pass the parameters like this. So that's even better. Now the question is, should we create flows or PowerFix function? So you know PowerFix function is PowerFix code that run in Dataverse on the server side. They support input, output parameter, but they cannot invoke connectors. And to create a PowerFix function, go to your solution, select automation function, define the name of the function, description, the input, the parameter, output parameter, and you put the code here. So you can manipulate Dataverse table, for instance. But you cannot use other connectors than Dataverse. What is interesting is that this function can be called from PowerFX code, right, in Power Apps, but you can also call it from Power Automate. Just use the performant on-bound action in selected environment, select the environment, and you will see your function, and you can pass parameter. Which is interesting, because there are some features in PowerFX that you don't have in Power Automate, like regular expression, for instance. So you can use regular expression. You can put regular expression in a PowerFX, and you can invoke it from Power Automate, for instance. Now the question is, should you create flows or PowerFix function? The difference is this: flows here, function. In a flow, you have a 30 days limitation. Function is 2 minutes. Flow can run asynchronously or synchronously. So function is always sync. In flows, you can have identity elevation. You cannot do that in function. You can use external connectors in flow. You cannot do that in function. You can have a flow that is triggered when an event is triggered, right? You cannot do that in function. And function flow were a bit slower than PowerFX code. That's not the case anymore. You will see that now we have a new feature that allow your flow to run extremely fast. That's in preview. So until recently, I would say, function were faster than flow, but that's not the case anymore. Now the question is, should we still learn Power Automate in this era of vibe coding? Actually, my answer is yes, because vibe coding works very well for Power Apps, because vibe coding rely on industry standard like React, JavaScript, TypeScript. So the world use all this stuff. So it's great for AI. But workflows, server-side code, that's different, right? So there's no real alternative or competitor to Power Automate. Nevertheless, vibe.powerapps.com cannot yet call flows or cannot yet call auto connectors. Actually, they can call connectors, but not yet flow. So I need to fix this mistake. But you cannot yet call flow directly. But you can call flow indirectly. You can say put the value, this value in this column of the my records, and then automatically your flow can be triggered. And then you can have Power Automate flow. Right? So example, I did implement an application for managing my expense. And in the expense, I did put some approval process. So people could submit expense. So when there is click submit, so this is the application here. When the status of the expense is open, the user can submit the expense to approval, like this, right? Click to approval. And then in my database, I've my table, normal table, and I did create one column call action. So, and I ask vibe coding to store to approve in this column when I submit to approval. And this trigger a flow, an automation flow, you see? So this is my flow when a row is added, modified, deleted. So if the column value is to approve the filter row, then I want this approval flow to start. So that's cool. Okay, so let's move to the second part. Some limitation of Power Automate. The first one, I mentioned it, is a flow duration is 30 days. So if you have this flow, start and wait for an approval, it will stop after 30 days. Okay? Actually, it's a bit more complex than this. It's a flow that use other connectors than Dataverse will stop after 30 days. So for instance, this flow, you see, with an apply to which and a delay of 10 months here, does not have any other connector than Dataverse. So it's fine, it's okay. Okay, more than 30 days is fine. This flow is the same flow, but with send an email. So it's not the Dataverse connector, then it will stop after 30 days. Now, approvals are kept forever, right? So even if your flow stop running, the approvals will remain in some system table of Dataverse, some approval tables in Dataverse, and these approval records don't have any retention policy by default. So if you want your approval flow to be able to manage more than 30 days, then you have to split your approvals into two flows. The first flow, you see, start from Power Apps, and then you respond immediately, and you create approval, right? So then it won't wait here. And then you have the second flow that listen the approval response table of your environment and will be triggered if something is added or modified in this table. So if someone approve or reject, then automatically this flow will be called. And it goes beyond 30 days. It can wait forever. So that's interesting. Another limitation is in Automate, you don't have state machine. So you can have, for instance, several level of approval, like this: approval 1, approval 2, approval 3. That's easy. You can check if outcome of approval 1 is approved, then you go to level 2, and then you go to level 3, right? That's easy if people say yes. The thing is, what if people say no? What are you going to do? Do you ask again, or what? So how do you manage the fact that you might want to get back? And if you have this business process, how do you implement this? So a user submit a content, then this content has to be validated by advisor. Then you go to secretariat. If it's approved, you go here. But if it's not approved, you go there. So you ask user to update the style. The user update the style. You go back here, and then you go back there. See, so how do you implement this stuff? So this is highly complicated with Power Automate. It's possible, but it's very complicated to maintain, and it's even more complex when the business change the business logic. So in 2017, I published the following pattern for managing that, which is you have a do until it's finished. You have a switch that tests the current value of the approval, and based on the status, you go to state 1, you see a case here, state 2 here, or here. But it's still limited to 30 days. So in 2018, I published a pattern that I've called a controller pattern, where you have the main flow, and the main flow called a child flow, actually independent flow called approver controller, which sent the approval request to another flow, level 1, and receive the answer. And based on the answer, it goes to level 2, get an answer, and to level 3, something like this. So I've called that a controller pattern. You can still find this publication on my blog in 2018. So yeah, 6 years ago. No, more than 6 years ago, right? So 8 years ago. You can also implement state machine by using business process flow. I did interesting experimentation called the BPM toolkit, where I managed state machine. So it was a POC that I did for Microsoft, and this POC is actually used in production by some customer. So you can have state machine, the system can go forward, go backward, etc. But in 2025, and this is something that I will illustrate in this session, I illustrate a new pattern based on AI. But that's for the last part of this session. All right, so let's talk about some good practices in Power Automate. And I will start with a bad practice. So when you share your flow, let's say you create a flow and you share your flow, there is a risk when you have what we call embedded connection. So let's say you create a flow that uses the O2 connector. So I'm the owner here, and I'm sharing. So this is my flow, you see, this flow, and send an email. And the send an email use my identity in the connection. Now I'm sharing my flow with a co-owner. Co-owner is user 1. When you do this, you'll get this warning. The co-owner can use your connection. And indeed, user 1 can edit this flow, add this action here, and send this not very friendly email to a guy working for IBM. But the thing is, he can use your connection. So the email will be sent on behalf of you. So that's the risk. You see? And this is why I recommend using service account or service principal, right? So deploy with a service account or service principal. Uh, Another reason is that if the maker leave the company, the account will be deactivated. So don't run the flow with uh, the a normal mail, a normal account, but use a service account. And because if people leave the company and the account is removed, this generate orphan flow. The flow run into an error, and that's the main cause of support. Even though Power Apps still work, but the flow stop running. So two solution, service account or service principal. So in my case, I use mostly service account. You will see why. So a service account is a normal account, can be a maker account, that's the maker account. Should usually have a Microsoft 365 license with a mailbox for sending or receiving mail. Should be a premium account. Should be MFA, multi-factor authentication, authenticated. But the problem with service account is there's no direct traceability or who changed the code, and they cost a license. So what my suggestion is that when you create something, a connection, use the service account. But when you edit the code, use your own personal account so that we can see who changed what. You have traceability. You can also use service principal, right? To use service principal, you need to define an app in Entra ID and provide some security rule for this app in Dataverse. And the service principal can be used as the owner of the flow and the owner of the Power Apps. It can be used in some action connection, but only if the connector support Entra ID, which and there is a very limited number of connectors that support Entra ID. It's Dataverse, HTTP with Entra ID, but that's very limited. They require license, so Automate per flow. We call that per flow, no, which is quite expensive. But the main problem is limited number of connectors that support service principal. Other good practice. So in 2018, I published the flow error pattern. And the idea is that you group all your code in three scope: try, catch, finally. Okay. So most of the code is in try. If something wrong happened, you go to catch. And in any case, you go to finally. Right. So this is my blog post at that time. Right. So here you can specify when you want some code to run, you see. So that's quite easy in Power Automate. And what I do is in the catch, I call a child flow, and I pass some information about the error to this child flow. So here, these are the parameters of my child flow. This is my child flow. I have one parameter called flow error data. The business process ID, and more information about the workflow. So typically, this is what I put in the flow error data, you see, the result of the scope. And result of the scope will return an array containing the status of each action of this scope or this action here. So basically, in the child flow, this is the child flow, I will loop through all the action to find the ones that have a status failed. And I will store that in a SharePoint list or in a Dataverse table, you see, like this. And what I provide an application monitoring that the business can use. So basically, this is my set of application here. And one of them is the BPM, the monitor, you see here, the error monitor. So the business can run this application and they will see this. So this display the status of all service that your application use, so all the flow. So we regularly check if the flow are up and running. And if there is any error, then you will see the error showing up here. Right? So this is one error in the flow, but you can have a mixture of error of flow and power-ups. And if IT click here now, IT will get into the Power Automate debugger, which is cool. Okay, so another good practice is for some specific complex queries, I use fetch XML. So fetch XML is the query language of Dataverse. By default, I use OData query filter because that's the standard and you can do a lot with OData. But in Dataverse, some features are only available in fetch XML. And that's the case for some complex queries like multi-table join, some outer joins, and some complex aggregation. But the thing is, and to use fetch XML example, so if this is the list row action in Dataverse, you have a property box here called fetch XML query where you can put your fetch XML code here. That's how you use fetch XML. And basically, to generate the fetch XML, most people use a free tool, open source tool created by the community called Fetch XML Builder. And Fetch XML Builder can be part of a big container that we call XRM Toolbox. So you use this tool to visually, so Fetch XML Builder, to visually generate your query, and you copy and paste that in your Power Automate. The problem is when you use the Dataverse connector in Power Automate, some feature, and especially the one that we are interested in, like are not supported, like distinct grouping aggregation operation. Example, you want to make a distinct query that returns unique value. You can do that in fetch XML. So let's say this distinct. Well, when you pass this query to list row, you'll get the following error. Key property cannot have new value. So it's a known issue. It's a very known issue. And the workaround is instead of using the Dataverse connector, you need to use the Dataverse Web API. And everything works with the Dataverse Web API. So if you to use it, you can use the HTTP with entry ID, invoke an HTTP request, and just create your fetch XML here, and you will pass your fetch XML to this invoke an HTTP request here. You see, like this. And it works. Everything works like this. All right. So now it's time to move to some new features, mostly AI. First, the feature is a new feature that Microsoft provides, which is now in a condition, you can debug your condition. So you can see the value of all component of your condition. So you can debug that. So that's very cool. You see, at runtime, you can see what the value are or where. That's nice. You just need to check the parameters view. So if you uncheck, you won't see anything. You won't see the detail. So that's nice. Now, a new feature that I really, really love is express mode. Make your flow faster. Now we have a new feature that only works in two triggers. This trigger when a power-ups call a flow, and the other one when an agent call a flow. You can check this in the trigger, express mode, you see. And when you do this, your flow will run much faster. For instance, my flow without this in the old mode took between 16 and 22 seconds to run, and in express mode is half a second. But the condition for this is the flow must be an AI flow. So it consumes messages. So that means that the flow must have the Copilot Studio plan. And you can have only maximum 100 action in your flow so far. And that's the current limitation. So indeed, it must be an agent flow, and it must run with Copilot Studio Plan. So billing per message. That means it can be visible in the Copilot Studio portal as well and in the Portomate portal. So that's what we call agent flow, right? But some features are only available in agent flow, like the express mode and many other features. There is a new advanced approval, which is only available in agent flow. So when your flow is an agent flow, it looks like this in Copilot Studio. But you can still edit your flow in Automate. Okay. So a normal flow can become an agent flow. Just create your flow in Automate, go to edit details and change the plan and it become a Copilot Studio. So by default, it's owner and switch to Copilot Studio. Then it's visible in both portals, Automate and Copilot Studio. You'll be charged by message, including AI Builder, right? So you'll be charged by message. Now, if we compare a feature from Automate Flow and Agent Flow, this is Automate Premium. You see in Automate Premium, standard connector, same in Agent Flow. Premium and custom connector can be used in Automate Premium, but also in Agent Flow. So you don't need a Automate Premium license to use premium feature in Agent Flow. You can switch to Agent Flow, right? You can have on-prem gateway as well. You don't have BPF. You don't have more Dataverse storage in Agent Flow. No process mining. No unattended desktop flow. So you don't get that when you use Agent Flow, of course. You can share your flow when it's an agent flow, but only if you edit your flow in Automate Designer, right? The run-only permission is available only if you edit your agent flow in Automate Designer, and you can copy a flow, but only in Automate Designer, right? So far, of course, this will change. Now, as I mentioned before, in 2018, I had to solve this issue. The use case is this. I work for a company that provided some medical content. And this medical content has to follow a quite strict approval process. And when it was approved, then the content was visible to the country. So it's quite sensitive. So the process is the following. Internal user submit a new content. So for instance, a new oath to use a new medication. And this content has to be validated by a group of people called advisor. If it's approved, we go to a group of people called secretariat that validate the style. If it's rejected, we ask user to update the content and we get back here. Same here, secretariat validates style, we approve, it goes to the next step, which is the boss authorized publication. Rejected, we go here and we resubmit a new change. When boss authorized, content is published. When boss reject, content is not published, right? This was a basic business process that I had to implement 8 years ago with Automate. And it was very hard. So now I try a new approach, which is basically how can AI help me implement this business process? And you'll find many examples of AI is simple business process, but not AI in complex business process like this. So just to illustrate concretely what I did. So first, I did create a model-driven apps application that looks like this, where you can follow the different stages. So here, people create a new content. When they create a new content, you see, boom, there is an approval process, an approval that is sent to advisor, and we see pending here. Okay. When it's approved, we go there. You see pending here. And you can follow the different status for each content. So that's easy to understand. Now the thing is, how can I rely on AI to solve this? Because it's very complicated to do this with Automate. So I start from a blank page, right? I didn't find anything on the web about this. So my idea was, why not creating an autonomous agent? An autonomous agent is an agent that is triggered by a flow, right? And my idea was, perhaps the state machine orchestration could be managed by the LLM, by an agent orchestrator. Okay? And after thinking a little bit more, I came to the conclusion that there is a one-to-one mapping between stages of my state machine and topic in my Copilot Studio agent. You see? So each stage can be a dedicated topic. So if I follow this pattern, then maybe this state machine can be implemented, right? So, and spoiler alert, it worked. So, but okay. What I did is I created a Copilot Studio agent and I provide the business instruction about the approval process here. Okay, but I didn't type this text. I was a little bit lazy. I'm still lazy. And I took the picture of the state machine and I asked ChatGPT to generate instruction for my agent. And I copy and paste this instruction into the instruction for the agent. You see? And the pattern, the technical pattern, is the following. So we have an autonomous agent, Copilot Studio agent, where we have the LLM, the orchestrator, and we have the trigger flow. And the trigger flow sends information to the orchestrator, the LLM. And the messages are the following. Hey, a new content has been submitted. Or advisor has approved, rejected. Or secretariat has approved or rejected, etc. These are the messages that my flow, trigger flow, send to the LLM, to the orchestrator. And based on this message, the orchestrator decides where to go. Oh, new content has been submitted. Let's go there. Or advisor, you see, advisor have approved. Let's go there. So the LLM decided to go to some specific topic based on the instruction that I did provide. And when the topic was run here, what happened in the topic? So actually, the topic sent an approval request. You see? So example, waiting for advisor or waiting for secretariat, these are approval. And I did create an approval flow that could be used by most topic. And when people approve, so the approval flow send an approval request, and when people approve, this send an event which trigger the flow. And we go back here, you see? So this is the technical pattern. So you have seen the non-technical pattern where each stage of the state machine is a topic, and this is actually the technical pattern. And it works very well. Okay? So this is an example of my implementation. And by the way, I'm going to share this implementation in GitHub in next week. But this is the trigger flow, you see. So when someone approve, reject, or something, does something, this flow is triggered. And we have an action called send a prompt to the specified Copilot for processing. And this is the prompt. A user create a new content with the value this. See, I send this to my agent. This is my agent. And the way I implement the thing is the following. First, I create an agent in Copilot Studio. Second, I define one topic for each stage. 3, I provide my instruction to the agent LLM. So I use the LLM as decision maker about which stage need to be performed. And one of the benefits is if the business logic change, I don't have any maintenance. And that's something I will illustrate. 4, I test the LLM in chat mode, you see. 5, I implement the approval flow and I call the flow from the topics. Then I test the agent in chat mode, so I see if the approval are sent. And then I implement the trigger flow. You see? This illustrates the workflow that send the approval. You see, it creates the approval here. It's called by an agent. And there is another pattern, which is before sending. So you see here, so this is the topic. In the topic, I call my flow, the flow I showed before. I pass the name of the actor, of course. And before sending an approval request, before calling the flow, the pattern that I'm proposing is the following. Generate a suggestion. So call a prompt from Copilot Studio about how to improve the process. So that means that basically people receive an approval request, you see, but they get also some AI suggestion about, for instance, the style of the content. Because before you you ask a prompt to give you more information about how to improve the approval. And everything works. You see, it works well. So I will skip this a little bit because I would like to illustrate one of the huge benefits of this approach. So first, it works. But second, it's easy to maintain. Because, and this is one change request that my customer did in 2018. This is nice, this is approval, but for some specific content, we want to bypass it. We want to go directly to boss. So first update, if the content is urgent, it must automatically be reviewed by boss. By boss. This. I didn't have to change my code. What I had to change was my instruction. At the bottom of my instruction, I've put this. If the content looks urgent, you can bypass validation through advisor and secretariat. You can ask boss directly. This is the programming language. English is the programming language. Natural language is the programming language. I didn't have to change anything else. It worked. Let's analyze the second update. If boss reject, the user must update the content. So if boss reject, we should be able to get back here and go to advisor, etc. What I changed was this. I just put this line. It worked. Third update, it's a bit more complex to understand. Because when we go to the approval process, sometimes we go several times to the same stage. But we know that my customer noticed that secretariat was a bottleneck, right? So what my customer wanted is that, okay, you can go through secretariat to validate the style one time, right? But not 2 times, not more than 1 time. So you are supposed to understand how the style works, the first step. So the secretariat should only check the style once. This is what I changed in the instruction. If secretariat validate the style at least 1 time, don't request secretariat to validate again. You can bypass this stage. And it worked. So that was really amazing. Okay, so we reached the conclusion. We can say this. So Power Automate can be used in mission critical application. I've done it plenty of time. Now it's really, really solid. It can be used alongside vibe coding. It is more about using the good pattern and following the best practices. Think about using an LLM as an orchestrator, so create autonomous agent. And it's not because you can do something that you have to do this. Okay? Keep it simple. So I hope that you enjoyed this session. Thank you very much.